A great final week of college football with the rivalries this week. Lots of great games, close games. I think when it comes to this next to the last top 25, you're only going to see one team fall out of the top 25 from last week and one team move in. Now, this is usually where I get my team wrong. I usually get 24 of the 25, and then this other team messes me up. Last week it was Clemson, which I kind of halfway predicted. This week, I think a similar situation may arise. This week's a little harder to predict because this was the last true regular season. We have the conference championship games coming up this week. So I don't know how much the committee allows that to play into their thinking as far as the teams that are left to play in the conference championship games. Do they get a little bit of a bonus for that? I don't know. They're not, by the rules, they're not supposed to. I'm just wondering if psychologically some of the committee members tend to want to push them up a little higher. I'm not going to assume that. I'm just going to base it on last week's rankings and go from there. And we'll see. I just don't think I'll get as many right this week as I got last week. I got more than half of the teams exactly right, and then everybody else was just one off. Essentially, again, Clemson was the one that I didn't predict, but I halfway did. I thought if I was wrong, Clemson would be the one, and that happened. So this week I think it's going to be a little fuzzier, even though I don't see much turnover. Again, I think one team drops out, one team comes in, but we'll see. There's several teams that are going to drop, and that predicting where those drops happen is always maybe the hardest part of this, because sometimes the committee doesn't drop them as much as you think, and sometimes they do. So let's take a look. Let's start with 25. One of those teams that I think will drop a bit this week, but not drop out, is Texas A&M. They may not drop all the way down to 25. I put them there just because it seems reasonable given what's coming up. They lost to LSU, Ed Ogeron's last game. Hard game at LSU. LSU's been playing well lately, but it's also Texas A&M's fourth loss. And the difference between 3 and 4 on the loss column is a pretty big one. That's where you start falling back into the pack, basically. Same thing goes from number 24, Wisconsin, losing this week to Minnesota. I think will drop them significantly back. We'll see if they fall that far. But one of the reasons why I'm dropping those two back is the team that I think will enter this week will be Minnesota. After beating Wisconsin, it would seem logical they would leap into the top 25. Now, the other team that could leap into the top 25 is Kentucky. They had a very good game against Louisville. Kentucky has been ranked in the past. A couple of weeks ago, they were ranked. They're 9-3. So if Kentucky were to move in, it would not surprise me. There's even a chance that Louisiana might move in. They're 11-1, heading to the Sun Belt Conference championship game. Texas San Antonio dropped out. They're the team that dropped out this week, or that will drop out, I'm predicting, because they lost pretty heavily to North Texas. And I think, they were ranked because they were undefeated, and they're no longer undefeated, so they will probably drop out. I'm putting Minnesota in due to them beating Wisconsin. Again, Kentucky or Louisiana would be logical alternatives to move into the top 25. We'll see how that goes. Arkansas, with their win this week, not necessarily a great win, but solid. Again, Arkansas has always just appeared to be a pretty solid team. They've been ranked most of the time. I think they'll end up moving up a couple of notches to 22 this week. Their season is over, as are the teams that I've already mentioned. Now, Houston's season is not over. They are going to Cincinnati to play in the American Championship game. That's a big game. Obviously, we'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. Clemson moves up to 20th. They finished the season pretty strong. They're looking a bit more like the Clemson of old. The ACC still is a pretty weak conference. They beat up on South Carolina from the SEC. South Carolina is a pretty pedestrian team this year. But Clemson is looking better. As the year went on, you could tell they were starting to get some of the pieces back into place. Looking good for next year. The big complaint about the playoffs has been that the same four teams always seem to get in, those four teams being Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Oklahoma. Well, Clemson's obviously not getting in. We'll take a look at those other four teams as we move along. San Diego State's heading to the Mountain West championship game against Utah State. I have them coming in at 19th. They will host that game, and they're home away from home in Carson, California. 18th, North Carolina State had one of the several really good games this week. North Carolina State, North Carolina was one of them. North Carolina State pulled out a late win, and I think they will end up being 18th. Utah is heading to the Pac-12 championship game, a rematch against Oregon, and the committee may move Utah up a little higher. We'll see. Right now I'm just keeping them at 17th, and we'll find out if I'm right about that on Tuesday. Wake Forest is heading to the ACC championship game against number 15 Pittsburgh. I think those two teams will be ranked. They'll be ranked back to back, I think. 15 and 16 seems to be the logical points for them. Again, the ACC is not a great conference this year, but they had a couple of teams really solidified toward the end, Pittsburgh being one of them. I think Pittsburgh is probably the best overall team in the ACC. North Carolina State, got to hand it to them. They also, I think, solidified. So did Clemson. Wake Forest has looked a little shakier, but they did get their win against Boston College to clinch their division. So Pittsburgh and Wake Forest will play this week. Iowa moves into the Big Ten championship game, and I think they move up to 14th. I could see them even moving up to 13th. BYU beat USC, another Power 5 win for BYU. So I don't think Iowa will move ahead of them because Iowa's 10-2. Now they could move up, and they are in the Big Ten championship game against Michigan that we'll talk about in a second. So could that move Iowa up ahead of BYU? It could. Oklahoma played Oklahoma State really well. I think better than probably even the committee might have thought they would. As a result, the committee has obviously not been impressed with Oklahoma this year. Oklahoma will drop, but I don't think they're going to drop that far. It was a bad loss in that it ends Oklahoma's chance to get into their championship game and maybe still get into the playoffs. Oklahoma being another one of those teams that always got into the playoffs, they're not going to do that this year. So I'm thinking that they'll drop only a little bit to 12th after giving Oklahoma State a really good game. Michigan State kind of surprised. They apparently had a lot of illnesses, but they still fought through all that to beat Penn State. I think they will move up to 11th. Oregon will go back into a rematch against Utah. I see them moving up to 10th. Now, if Oregon wins this game, their playoff chances are done. But I can see Oregon leapfrogging a couple of spots if they beat Utah in the rematch and move into the Rose Bowl. The winner of that game will play in the Rose Bowl. So they'll probably play, I'm assuming, Iowa if Iowa loses the Big Ten championship game, as they're now expected to do. But, we'll wait and see if that happens. Ole Miss won their last game. They're also 10-2. I see them moving on up into the 9th spot. Baylor will go play Oklahoma State in the Big 12 championship game. They did not have what I would consider to be a great win, but they did win their game. There's a lot of teams that had just nail-biting kind of wins this week, so I think that sort of protects everybody in that regard. So Baylor at 8th will play Oklahoma State in the Big 12 a very important game, as we'll talk about in a second. Ohio State, I had predicted they would finish in the playoffs. They were looking great, but just ran into a buzzsaw. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Ohio State's chances of the playoffs, I won't say they're completely done. There is a sort of a wild scenario that could happen where a team like Ohio State could work their way. Well, I'm not even going to say they'd work their way in. They would have to be pushed back in, essentially, by so many teams losing ahead of them. But they are at the very outer edge of the possibility. They have no way of doing it themselves. They're kind of shut out now. They would have, everybody talks about chaos. Well, chaos truly would have to reign for Ohio State to be pushed back into the playoffs. There is a possibility, and we'll talk more about that here in a second. Oklahoma State, I thought they were going to blow it against Oklahoma again. I'd gotten on the bandwagon, though, and they actually came through. They and Oklahoma traded mistakes in the second half until Oklahoma State ended up winning the game. And that puts Oklahoma State in a good position. I know they're sixth, but they're going to play Baylor, who I think is going to be eighth, for the Big 12 championship game. If they win that game, and I think they will, I think they will leapfrog number 5, Notre Dame. Notre Dame is done. They're an independent. They don't have a conference championship game. And remember, winning a conference championship is one of those things that the committee can take into consideration if you have two teams that are very even with each other. Notre Dame and Oklahoma State have been back-to-back now for a couple of weeks. So the committee obviously considers them to be pretty close to each other. Apparently, they've considered Notre Dame to be slightly better than Oklahoma State. Now, it's possible, since Oklahoma State beat Oklahoma, that Oklahoma State could move up into number 5 this week. Possible. I don't think it really matters at this point. The question becomes, can Oklahoma State win that championship game? If they do, I think they move up into the playoffs. Whether they're 5th or 6th this week really doesn't matter. Notre Dame still has a chance because they're going to be so close to the edge of the playoffs. But like Ohio State, they're going to have to be essentially pushed into the playoffs by other teams losing. Notre Dame cannot get in on their own merit at this point. Cincinnati, I think, will remain number 4 this week. They are hosting the American Championship game against Houston. Houston's a ranked team. So if Cincinnati's at 4, or even if they may even move up to 3 this week, who knows, but I think they'll be 4. They beat another ranked team. It's going to be very, very hard for the committee to justify suddenly moving a conference champion at number 4 who beat a ranked team. I just don't see them dropping them. So Cincinnati, unless they drop them in this poll down to 5th or something, which I don't see them doing that. If Cincinnati's at the 4 spot, if they're in the top 4 and they become conference champion, expect them in the playoffs. Now, I think it's in their hands. Again, some people still kind of hold out because they're group of 5, but I think now it would be very difficult to justify not putting Cincinnati in. I think there'll be 4. Michigan, give it up there for Jim Harbaugh. He's caught so much grief. I've given him grief over the years. I did not think he could beat Ohio State. I just thought he couldn't do that. But you know what? Harbaugh has shown finally what it takes to be not just a good coach, but a greater coach. He has adapted this year. It took him a while, but he changed things up. He changed his coaching staff. He made his offense a bit more not unpredictable, a bit more balanced. But they're still the same kind of tough, hard-nosed team you would expect a good Michigan team to be. And they just pushed Ohio State around on off. Ohio State could not stop them in the second half. Michigan was just running it right down their throat. And Michigan has the defense to keep Ohio State contained. And Ohio State, remember, has probably one of the 2 best offenses in the country. And Michigan kept that offense contained. Obviously, playing at home helped. The weather may have helped. It's very cold, a little snow, that kind of thing. But give it up for Michigan. They move into the spot that I thought Ohio State would have. But now Michigan takes over that spot at number 3. And now if they were to get upset by Iowa and Cincinnati were to lose, and Alabama, who I put at second, who barely beat Auburn, Alabama continues to do this thing where everybody kind of knows that they're talent-wise they're as good or better than everybody else, but they continue to just sort of do what they have to do, but hand it to them. They go into these tough places. Everybody up against them is doing their best to beat them. Auburn is always a tough game for Alabama in every year. Alabama was down 10-0 going into the fourth quarter with that offense. I was not expecting them to be shut out for 3 quarters. So Auburn was really playing way over their head, I think. But Alabama did something this week. Even though they struggled, they gutted it out and won. That showed a mental toughness there to this team that I haven't seen up until now. So even though it was hardly an impressive win, like they didn't go in there and just blow Auburn away. But you never really expect Alabama, even in a good year, to just go in and blow Auburn away at Auburn. That for anybody not in the South who doesn't know about this rivalry for the people playing in it is more intense probably than, all respect Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama, Auburn is just it's one of those things you just have to kind of experience to believe. But Alabama, I think, deserves the second spot now. It's possible Michigan could move up to 3. Georgia, of course, is the first. And I just don't see Alabama beating Georgia, but hey, I didn't see Michigan beating Ohio State either. So, let's take a look at this now. We've got Georgia is in the playoffs. Them losing to Georgia Tech, as impossible as that would have seemed, would have been the only way that Georgia could have been threatened to not make the playoffs. Georgia's in. Alabama has to. I still think they have to beat Georgia to get in, and they could, because they'll be fighting for their lives. Alabama's the last of the teams that's been in the playoffs every year, pretty much. Still have a chance to get in, I think, a realistic chance. But beating Georgia, a pretty big mountain to climb. I don't think they'll do it. I think they'll drop out. I think Michigan will beat Iowa. Michigan will probably end up being the 2nd seed. Cincinnati, I think, moves up to 3rd seed, I think, depending upon how they do in the championship. And Houston could beat them. It would not surprise me if Houston beat Cincinnati, but I think Cincinnati will win it and they'll be in. And I think Oklahoma State at 6 will win and go in as well. They'll either go in at 3 or 4. So Georgia versus Cincinnati, Georgia versus Oklahoma State, Michigan versus Cincinnati, Michigan versus Oklahoma State. Those are now the 4. Notre Dame, Cincinnati, and Alabama were to both lose, or if Oklahoma State loses, I think Notre Dame can be pushed in. And if several of those teams lose, I think Ohio State even could be pushed back in. I don't see Baylor, even if Baylor would upset Oklahoma State, I don't think they would move into the playoffs. Ole Miss is done. Oregon can move up several spots if they beat Utah. They can move back up ahead of Ohio State, for example, but not get into the playoffs. I think they're done. Everybody else is done. So you're looking at Georgia being in. Alabama has to win to be in. Michigan still has to win to be in, but they're favored to win, unlike Alabama. Cincinnati winning in, but they're favored. They're playing at home. Notre Dame is now idle. They have to have help. Oklahoma State win, and I think they're in if Alabama loses. That's the key. If Alabama beats Georgia, well, then Alabama's in. The Big Ten team, Michigan, if they win, they're in. Cincinnati wins, they're in. That would kind of leave Oklahoma State shut out. The committee would have to move Oklahoma State ahead of Cincinnati. A Cincinnati team that's undefeated, a conference champion. That's kind of hard to see. But those are the possibilities moving into the final week of the regular season. So thanks for listening.